What happens when the person who knows all your secrets uses them to call you worthless? Elena Hayes wasn't just divorced. She was deleted. Her ex-husband, Mark Vane, took her research, her youth, and her dignity, leaving her with one word: useless. He thought he'd buried her in the wreckage of their marriage, stepping over her to build his new shiny life. He never expected she'd be unearthed by the one man he was desperate to impress. This is the story of how a single quiet word from a billionaire in front of the entire world turned one woman's ruin into her ultimate revenge. The final meeting wasn't in a courtroom. It was in the sterile, beige-walled office of a mediator, a place designed to have no personality, no memory. It was perfect. Elena Hayes sat opposite Mark Vane, her husband of 12 years, her ex-husband, in precisely 7 more minutes. The mediator, a woman named Ms. Peterson, was droning on about asset division. But all the assets had already been divided. Mark, in a gesture of magnanimity, had bought her out of their Upper East Side apartment, the one she had found decorated and turned into a showpiece, for a sum that was technically fair, but felt like an insult. He had given her, as he'd phrased it to his lawyer, everything she needed to start over. What he meant was a check small enough to be a leash, forcing her to find a new life, but ensuring it would be a small one. Mark checked his watch, a rose gold Patek Philippe, the one she'd saved for 3 years to buy him after his first big deal. He wore it like a trophy of his own success. "Is that everything, Pamela?" he asked, cutting the mediator off. "I have a 2 o'clock at the new offices." "Almost, Mr. Vane," Ms. Peterson said, peering over her glasses. "We just need Mrs. Hayes. Elena's signature on the addendum regarding the art collection." Elena's stomach tightened. The art collection was 3 prints she'd bought at a student auction when she was still working on her doctorate at Columbia, before Mark. "She can have them," Mark said, waving a dismissive hand. "They're worthless." A tiny, sharp sound escaped Elena's throat. It was almost a laugh. Mark's eyes, once warm now, a flat, polished blue, snapped to hers. "What?" "Nothing, Mark. Just nostalgic. I remember you liked that Kandinsky print." "I liked it when we were 25 and living in a 4th-floor walk-up." "Elena, my tastes have evolved." He gestured to his own bespoke suit. "I'm now in the business of originals, not dorm room posters." "They're not worthless," she said, her voice quiet. "The provenance on the small lithograph is interesting." Mark leaned forward, and the air crackled with the familiar acidic condescension she hadn't realized she'd been dreading. Elena let it go. "You were good at the hobby, the little research papers, the interesting provenance. But that's not the real world. In the real world," he tapped the mahogany table, "value is what a buyer is willing to pay, and no one is paying for your opinions." He smiled, a tight corporate pulling of the lips. "It's why this is for the best. I'm in the yes business. I build things. I make deals. And you, well, you were always in the no business. No, Mark, that's not historically accurate. No, Mark, the research doesn't support that. You're an anchor, Elena. A very lovely, very educated, and completely useless anchor." There it was, the word, the one he had been dancing around for months, the one that had echoed in the silence of their apartment as he stayed out later and later, his phone buzzing with names she didn't know, the one that summed up her entire sacrifice. She had been the one to ghostwrite the proposals that won him his first clients. Her art history research, her understanding of cultural narratives had been the secret sauce for his Vane Global Strategies consulting firm. She had built his database. She had networked for him. She had given up her dissertation, her life's work on obscure Dutch masters, to be his unpaid, uncredited partner. And now she was useless. She picked up the pen. Her hand was shaking, but not from sadness. It was the adrenaline of a 1,000-volt shock. She signed her name, Elena Hayes, for the last time. "You're right, Mark," she said, standing up. She pushed the papers across the table. "My opinions are worthless. To you." She walked out of the room, leaving him with the mediator. She didn't look back. She walked past the sleek minimalist reception area, out the glass doors, and onto the pavement of Lexington Avenue. The noise of the city hit her like a physical blow. She was 38 years old. She had a master's degree in art history, half a dissertation, and a check that would barely cover a year's rent in a decent neighborhood. Mark Vane was already in his chauffeured Escalade, probably taking a call, probably laughing. He had his new office, his new clients, and as she'd seen on page 6, his new girlfriend, a 22-year-old influencer named Chloe, who was famous for, well, Elena couldn't figure out for what. Elena Hayes was for the first time in her adult life completely and utterly alone. And a voice in her head whispered completely and utterly useless. The first 6 months were a blur of beige boxes, beige walls in her new tiny studio in Astoria, Queens. The beige, tasteless coffee from the bodega on the corner. Elena had sold the 3 worthless prints. The small lithograph, the one with the interesting provenance, had been misattributed. Her research had been correct. It wasn't a student piece. It was a preparatory sketch for a much larger lost work. It sold at a minor Christie's auction for $42,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was hers. And it was enough to keep the wolves at bay for another year. It was the first breath she'd taken since the mediator's office. But the silence of the 400-square-foot apartment was deafening. Her entire life had been built around Mark. His schedule, his dinners, his clients, his needs. Now with that scaffolding gone, she felt formless. She would go for days without speaking to anyone. The useless label had burrowed under her skin like a parasite. Mark had been so effective in his dismissal that he had in effect erased her. She would look at the Columbia University website at the page for the art history department and feel a wave of nausea. She was a fraud, a dropout, a failed academic who had become a failed wife. One rainy Tuesday in April, she was staring at her blank laptop screen, a job application for junior executive assistant glowing mockingly when her phone buzzed. It was an email from an old college acquaintance, Sarah. Subject: job. Gagosian. You interested the Gagosian, the gleaming billion-dollar behemoth of the art world. Elena opened the email. It wasn't for a curator. It wasn't for a researcher. It was for a gallery assistant and archivist. The job description was glorified data entry with a side of fetching coffee. It was a job for a 22-year-old recent graduate. It paid, she noted grimly, barely enough to live on. She closed the laptop. It was beneath her. She had debated esoteric points of 17th-century pigment composition with the world's leading experts. She had been published in minor journals. She was also, she realized, staring at a half-eaten container of stale lo mein. She opened the laptop and wrote back to Sarah. I'm very interested. Thank you. The interview was humbling. The director, a terrifyingly chic woman named Diana, didn't even look at her resume. Sarah speaks highly of you, Diana had said, not looking up from her screen. But you're mature for this role, and you've been out of the game for, she finally looked at the paper, 12 years. What exactly have you been doing? I was a private consultant, Elena said, the lie tasting like ash. For a global strategies firm. Ah, Diana said, her eyes instantly glazing over. Corporate. Boring. Elena saw the interview slipping away. She had one shot. But my specialty, Elena said, her voice finding a sudden steel edge, was provenance, specifically post-Renaissance European. For instance, the Lost Muse attributed to Van Honthorst that sold at Sotheby's last fall. It was a fake. The pigment analysis was flawed, the canvas weave was 18th century, not 17th, and the subject's stomacher was a design that didn't exist until 1650. The painting was dated 1632. Diana's head came up, slowly. She had been at that auction. She had almost bid on that painting. How did you know that? I wrote a paper on it, Elena said. It wasn't published. It was for my private consultant. Diana stared at her for a long, silent minute. You'll be cataloging our digital archives. It's tedious. And you'll be on the front desk 3 days a week. You'll answer phones. You'll get coffee for clients. You'll be invisible. The pay is $48,000 a year. When do I start? Elena asked. The next 3 months were the hardest of her life. She was as promised invisible. She was Ellie or Anna or just you to the impossibly young, impossibly rich, and impossibly arrogant assistants who swarmed the gallery. She was 39, wore a simple black sheath dress from a thrift store, and fetched $12 almond milk lattes for 24-year-olds named Arabella. She spent her nights in the digital archives. The Gagosian system was a mess. Decades of high-value transactions stored with all the care of a teenager's iTunes library. Elena worked. She worked with the quiet, furious focus of a woman with nothing else. She cross-referenced. She built new taxonomies. She found mislabeled files, missing provenance records, and 2 instances of works that had been sold twice. She didn't tell anyone. She just fixed it. She created a new encrypted and intuitive system. Mark, she heard, had landed a massive new client. She saw him and Chloe in Vogue at some gala. He was quoted in the Wall Street Journal as a visionary in global logistics. His new catchphrase was, "Connecting the past to the future." Elena deleted the article, drank her beige coffee, and went back to work. She was just an archivist, just a coffee fetcher, just a useless anchor doing a useless, invisible job. The first time she saw Damian Blackwood, she didn't know who he was. He was just an anomaly. It was a Thursday, her day at the front desk. The gallery was quiet, shimmering in the late afternoon sun. He walked in without a security detail, which was unusual. He wore a simple dark gray t-shirt and jeans. This was not unusual. The uniform of the billionaire was intentional norm-core. But his clothes fit him with a bespoke perfection that cost more than her annual salary. The real anomaly was his silence. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at his phone. He just looked. He stood in front of a massive, chaotic Anselm Kiefer painting for a full 10 minutes. Elena, used to clients who photographed the art before they'd even seen it, watched him on the security monitor. He wasn't just looking, he was reading it. He moved to the next piece, a delicate, unnerving sculpture by a new artist. He didn't circle it. He just found the correct viewing angle and stayed there. Elena was so engrossed in watching him watch, she didn't realize Diana, the gallery director, was sprinting from her office, a fixed, terrified smile on her face. "Mr. Blackwood, we weren't expecting you." Diana's voice was 3 notes higher than usual. Blackwood. Elena's blood went cold. Damian Blackwood. Not just rich, but foundational. Blackwood Holdings was in everything from global shipping to satellite technology. He was a ghost, a myth. He never did interviews. He never went to galas. He was supposedly the largest private collector of antiquities and modern art in the world, but no one knew what he owned because he never lent anything to museums. And he was here, in her gallery. "Diana," he said. His voice was low, and it carried. He didn't turn to her. "This sculpture. The provenance is listed as Private European Collection. Which one?" "Ah, well, Mr. Blackwood, as you know, our sellers value discretion." "It's the von Hess collection," Blackwood stated. "It was looted by the Nazis in 1941, disappeared in 45, and resurfaced in Zurich in the 80s. This is from the Zurich find. You're selling stolen art." The silence in the gallery was so complete Elena could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Diana was paper white. I assure you, our records are..." The provenance was cleared. "Your records are wrong," Blackwood said. He wasn't angry. He was just stating a fact. It was more terrifying than yelling. He finally turned to Diana. "I was considering a purchase. I am no longer. You should call your lawyers." He started to walk to the door. This was it. The Gagosian was about to be blacklisted by the most important collector alive. A scandal would erupt. Diana's career would be over. Elena's job, her fragile new life, would be gone. "He's wrong." Elena said it. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. They were quiet, but in the echoing silence they sounded like a gunshot. Damian Blackwood stopped. He turned his head, not his body. His eyes, a very pale, clear gray, found her at the desk. He didn't look surprised. He just looked attentive. Diana looked like she was going to be physically ill. "Elena, be quiet." "He's wrong," Elena said again, her voice stronger. She stood up. Her knees were shaking. "Mr. Blackwood, you are respectfully incorrect. It is not from the Von Hess collection. You're right that the private European collection is a red flag for the Zurich find. But this piece," she pointed, "is from the artist's Red period, which she only began in 1946 after she fled Berlin. The Von Hess collection was catalogued in 1941. This piece couldn't have been in it." She walked on autopilot to the gallery's computer. Her fingers flew. She was in the archives. Her archives. The artist's own studio diaries, which were only translated in 2011, reference this specific sculpture. She gifted it to her patron, a baker in Brussels, who hid her during the war. It remained in his family's private, non-notable collection until his granddaughter consigned it to us. The private European collection isn't a lie to hide a Nazi-looted past. It's a promise to a Belgian family that didn't want their name published. The provenance is clean. She turned the monitor to face him. There it was. The scanned page from the diary. The bill of sale from 1952. The consignment contract. All cross-referenced. All perfect. Diana was breathing again. Damian Blackwood walked over to the desk. He was tall. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at Elena. His gaze was intense, analytical. It was like being examined by a high-powered microscope. He looked at her cheap dress, her worn-out flats, her unmanicured hands on the keyboard. Then he looked at her face. "You've been here how long?" he asked. 3 months, sir." "And you rebuilt this entire archival system in 3 months?" It wasn't a question. "It was disorganized," Elena said lamely. He let the silence stretch. Then he looked at Diana. "I'll take the kefir." Diana nearly collapsed. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, of course. Right away." "And," he said, his gaze shifting back to Elena, "I want her to handle the paperwork." He pulled a simple, heavy black business card from his pocket. It had no name, no title, just a phone number and an email address. He handed it not to Diana but to Elena. "You'll invoice me through my holding company. You," he said, tapping the card, "will be my only point of contact. This file and all future Blackwood acquisitions are to be managed by you, exclusively." Elena took the card. Her fingers brushed his. It was like touching a battery. "And you," he said to Diana, "should give her a raise. The current market rate for a senior provenance expert and archivist is about 4 times what you're paying her. Don't you think?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the gallery. The glass door hissed shut behind him, leaving a profound, vibrating silence in his wake. The next day, Elena was moved to an office. It was a glorified closet on the 3rd floor, but it had a door that closed. Her salary was, as Blackwood had suggested, quadrupled. Diana now treated her with a mixture of terror and fawning respect. The other assistants who had once sent her for coffee now asked if she needed anything. It was hollow. The victory felt strange. It wasn't hers. It had been given to her by a man who walked in and rearranged her life in 5 minutes as easily as he'd bought a $20 million painting. She was still a pawn, just a more expensive one. She threw herself into the Blackwood account. It was a fortress. The holding company, Ethelred Logistics, was designed to be impenetrable. Handling the invoice for the kefir was a masterclass in international art law, tax codes, and encrypted communications. Elena didn't just handle it. She optimized it. She found a loophole in the Swiss-U.S. tax treaty that saved him 6 figures in import duties. She didn't ask. She just did it, sending the revised and filed paperwork to the email address on the black card. The reply came 2 hours later. It was one line. Well done. My car will be outside your apartment at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Elena stared at the message. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. She felt a flicker of the old fear, the helplessness. This is how it started with Mark. The dinners, the commands, the slow erosion of her own will. But she was wrong. The next morning, a sleek, unmarked black sedan was waiting. It didn't take her to a fancy breakfast. It took her to a heliport on the west side. She was bundled into a Sikorsky S-76 helicopter. And there, sitting across from her reading a physical paper-bound book, was Damian Blackwood. "Ms. Hayes," he said, not looking up. "Thank you for coming." "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice tight. "My warehouse," he said, "in Teterboro." The warehouse was a nondescript climate-controlled bunker larger than a football field. It wasn't a collection. It was a library of civilization. He walked her through aisles of artifacts. Greek marbles, Egyptian sarcophagi, Renaissance bronzes. Each piece was stored with museum-quality precision. "Most of this is junk," he said, waving a hand at a priceless-looking Roman bust. Elena blinked. I don't understand." "It's all real," he said. "The provenance is clean. It's all fine. But it's dead. It's just stuff that rich men are supposed to own. My father and grandfather collected this. I'm not a collector, Ms. Hayes. I'm a seeker." He stopped in front of a heavily secured door. "I'm a seeker of things that are true, things that have been lost and found, things with a story that hasn't been told." He opened the door. The room was empty save for one painting on an easel draped in a cloth. "I'm considering a new acquisition," he said. "The seller is a man named Mark Vane." Elena's heart stopped. Not just slowed. Stopped. The air left her lungs. She gripped the doorframe to stay upright. "He runs a global strategies firm." Blackwood continued, his back to her, watching the painting. "He says he's a visionary. He's trying to broker a sale for a new client of his. He's been trying to get a meeting with me for a year. I finally granted it. He's bringing the piece here in 2 days." What is the piece?" Elena managed to whisper. Her throat was full of sand. "It's a painting he claims to have discovered," Blackwood said. He pulled the cloth away. Elena knew it instantly. She would have known it in the dark. She would have known it if it were shattered into a million pieces. It was a small dark portrait of a woman with sad eyes. The Lost Muse. A minor Dutch master. It was the centerpiece of her abandoned dissertation. The painting she had tracked for 5 years. The one she had written 80 pages on, proving it was the key to a whole new understanding of the artist's studio. The painting Mark Vane had told her was a dead end and a waste of time. Vane claims his research has definitively proven this is the work of... What was his name? Blackwood consulted his phone. Gerard van Honthorst. He says it's the lost companion piece to The Procuress. He's asking for $50 million. Elena's mind was racing. Mark. How? He didn't have her research. She had taken all her files. Wait. No. She hadn't. She had backed up her entire dissertation to his cloud drive, the family drive, right before she left. She'd forgotten. In the chaos of the divorce, she had forgotten. He hadn't discovered this. He had stolen it. He had stolen her life's work, and now he was going to sell it to Damian Blackwood for $50 million. He's a very good salesman. Blackwood said, his voice neutral. His presentation is slick. He turned to look at her. His pale gray eyes missed nothing. He saw the color drain from her face. He saw the way her hands were clenched. He saw the flicker of sheer murderous rage quickly followed by a wave of profound soul-crushing despair. He knew. He didn't know how he knew, but he knew. "I need," Damian Blackwood said, "an expert opinion. I need to know if this painting is true. I need a provenance expert. I need you to tell me if Mark Vane's research is sound." This was it. This was the test. He was giving her a choice. She could stay silent. Let the man who destroyed her make $50 million off her back. Keep her new high-paying job. Be a good, quiet, grateful employee. Or his research. Elena said, her voice shaking but hardening into something new, something cold and sharp. Is a lie. Damian Blackwood smiled. It was a small, thin, and absolutely terrifying smile. I thought so, he said. My car is picking up Mr. Vane and his associate for a presentation at the new Sotheby's Gallery Friday at 8 p.m. You, Ms. Hayes, will be my guest. The 2 days leading up to Friday were the longest of Elena's life. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She lived in her tiny office, fueled by black coffee and a cold, simmering fury that was more potent than caffeine. Damian Blackwood had given her one instruction: be prepared. He had also given her a Blackwood Holdings corporate credit card and the name of a stylist. Mr. Vane places a great deal of value on appearances, he'd said. It's his primary weakness. We will, of course, exploit that. Elena had balked, but she understood the logic. This wasn't a personal makeover. It was armor. She wasn't just Elena Hayes, the archivist. She was representing Blackwood Holdings. The stylist, a severe woman named Monique, descended on her like a military commander. When she was finished, Elena barely recognized the woman in the mirror. The thrift store sheath was gone. In its place was a deep emerald green silk wrap dress that skimmed her body, hinting at a strength she hadn't known she possessed. It was by Roland Mouret, a designer she knew from her days reading Vogue for Marc. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, and Monique had insisted on a bold red lipstick. A declaration, she'd called it. For the first time, she didn't look like useless Elena. She looked like a woman who could and would end someone. But the real work was happening in her mind. She wasn't just going to say Marc was a liar. She was going to prove it systematically in a way that he could not escape. She went back to her own research. The 80 pages she had written. She knew it by heart. The twist, the part Marc could never have known because he didn't do the work, was that the painting wasn't by Van Honthorst. That was the red herring. That's what less educated academics thought. Her research proved it was by a contemporary, a woman, Judith Leister, a brilliant painter who had been overshadowed by her male peers, her work often misattributed to them. Proving this painting was hers would rewrite a chapter of art history. Marc, in his arrogance, had not just stolen her research, he had misinterpreted it. He had taken her initial basic findings, the "maybe it's Van Honthorst" section, and ignored the complex, nuanced, and brilliant conclusion. He had taken the hook and missed the story. He wasn't just a thief. He was a bad thief. This gave Elena her weapon. She didn't need to accuse him of theft. She didn't need to bring up their marriage. She just needed to let him build his entire presentation, his entire $50 million case on the wrong premise. And then she would pull the pin. She compiled her real research into a sleek digital presentation. She embedded scans of Leister's other known works showing the identical brushwork. She included pigment analysis from a paper she'd had published under a pseudonym years ago. She built an ironclad, irrefutable case. She was not just going to expose Marc. She was going to humiliate him on a professional level he couldn't even comprehend yet. On Friday, at 7:30 p.m., the black car arrived. Elena walked out of her Astoria apartment building, the doorman staring. The car took her to the new gleaming Sotheby's headquarters. This wasn't a public auction. It was a private viewing hosted by Sotheby's for one of their most important clients, Damian Blackwood. She stepped out of the car. Damian was waiting for her, not inside but on the pavement. He too was transformed. Gone was the t-shirt. He wore a stunning dark blue Tom Ford suit. He looked every inch the billionaire. He looked her up and down, his pale gray eyes approving. "Ms. Hayes, you look definitive. You look like a client," she replied. He smiled. "So I do." He offered his arm. "Are you ready?" "He's not going to know what hit him," she said. That's the idea, Damien said. Oh, and one more thing. I had my legal team look into Mr. Vane's new offices and his Vane Global Strategies. It's a house of cards, Elena. He's leveraged to the hilt. This $50 million sale isn't just a bonus. He needs it. He's desperate. Elena paused her hand on his arm. This changed things. A cornered animal is the most dangerous. Good, she said, her voice hardening. I'm glad. They walked into the glass atrium, and there, standing under a massive chandelier, was Mark. He was schmoozing a Sotheby's executive, a glass of champagne in his hand. Beside him, clinging to his arm, was Chloe. She was wearing a red dress that was by all measures wearing her. She looked bored and beautiful. Mark was in his element. He was laughing, gesturing expansively. He was the king of the world. Then he saw them. He saw Damien Blackwood, the man he'd been chasing for a year, the man who held his entire future in his hands. And on Damien Blackwood's arm, looking like a goddess of vengeance, was his ex-wife. Mark Vane's smile didn't just fade. It shattered. Mark recovered, but it was a clumsy, visible effort. He plastered the smile back on, but it didn't reach his eyes. He disengaged from the Sotheby's exec and strode toward them, Chloe bouncing in his wake. Damien? What a pleasure. I'm so glad we could finally make this happen. Mark stuck out his hand. Damien took it, his grip firm and brief. Mark, thank you for arranging this. Mark's gaze flickered to Elena. It was a masterpiece of controlled condescension. He looked her up and down, taking in the dress, the hair. He was searching for the frumpy, defeated woman he'd left. This was confusing. Elena, he said, his voice dripping with false surprise. My goodness, you're here. Are you working the event catering? Chloe giggled, a high-pitched tinkling sound. Babe, that's so rude. Maybe she's his assistant. Before Elena could say a word, Damien Blackwood stepped half an inch closer to her, his arm still linked with hers. Ms. Hayes is my senior advisor, he said, his voice a quiet chill in the warm room. She is the only person on this continent whose opinion on 17th century art I trust. Her word is final. Mark's face went through a rapid series of emotions, confusion, then irritation, then a dawning, ugly suspicion. He'd been outmaneuvered, but he didn't know how. Ah, Mark said, forcing a laugh. Of course. Always had her little hobbies, my Elena. Well, I'm thrilled you're putting that doctorate to good use. The sneer on doctorate was unmistakable. Shall we proceed to the viewing room? A Sotheby's representative interrupted, sensing the tension. The room was dark, designed for drama. On a velvet-draped wall, illuminated by a single perfect spotlight, was The Lost Muse. It was beautiful, and it was Elena knew lying. Gentlemen, Ms. Hayes. Mark began taking the floor. He was back in his element. This was his pitch. What you are looking at is not just a painting. It's a missing piece of history. For the next 20 minutes, Mark Vane spun a tale. He was good. She had to give him that. He was a brilliant storyteller, a master of an empty narrative. He used all the right words: groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting, undiscovered. And he used her words. He presented her initial research, the links to Van Honthorst, the notes on the pigment. He'd had it bound into a glossy, impressive-looking portfolio with Vane Global Strategies embossed in gold on the cover. Elena stood beside Damien, her face a mask of calm professional interest. She let him talk. She let him dig his own grave deeper and deeper. And so, Mark concluded, his voice ringing with false triumph, we have definitively a lost Van Honthorst, a companion to the procuress. The value, of course, is, well, it's priceless. But the seller, my client, is willing to part with it for the sum we discussed, $50 million. He smiled triumphant, looking at Damien. A bargain for a piece of history. The room was silent. Damien Blackwood did not look at Mark. He did not look at the painting. He looked at Elena. Ms. Hayes, he said simply. Your opinion. This was it. Elena stepped forward. She didn't look at Mark. She addressed Damien, the Sotheby's reps, and the painting itself. "It's an interesting presentation, Mr. Vane," she said. "Your research is thorough, up to a point." Mark's smile tightened. "Up to a point. You've correctly identified the pigment composition as being from the Utrecht school." Elena continued, her voice the calm, clear tone of a lecturer. "And your analysis of the canvas is adequate. You've concluded, therefore, that it must be Van Honthorst." "The evidence is overwhelming," Mark said, puffing up. "The evidence is in fact overwhelmingly misleading," Elena countered. "And if you had continued the research instead of stopping at the most obvious and most marketable conclusion, you would have known that." She pulled a small, sleek tablet from her clutch. "May I?" She nodded to the display port. Mark's face was now a mask of confusion. "What is this?" "This," Elena said as her tablet connected and her own presentation flashed onto a screen beside the painting, "is the actual research. Ms. Hayes has prepared a brief counter-analysis." Damien Blackwood supplied to the room. For the next 10 minutes, Elena didn't just debunk Mark's pitch, she annihilated it. "Mark, Mr. Vane, has presented this as a Van Honthorst, but the brushwork specifically on the lace collar and the reflection in the subject's eyes is inconsistent with Honthorst's known authenticated work. He was a master of light, yes, but he was sloppy with detail." She zoomed in on the painting, then on a known Van Honthorst. "See, Honthorst's lace is a suggestion of lace. This," she zoomed back to the muse, "is a photograph of lace. Every thread is perfect." Mark was starting to sweat. That just proves it's a masterpiece." "It proves it's not his." Elena cut him off. "It is in fact the signature authenticated brushwork of Judith Leister." She flashed 3 more paintings on the screen. Leister, Leister, and Leister. The same hands, the same rendering of light on pearls, the same precise photographic lace. "You see, Mr. Vane Leister was so good that after her death, her work was systematically and often fraudulently reattributed to her male contemporaries like Franz Hals, or in this case Van Honthorst. She was a woman. She was erased." She looked directly at Mark, her eyes like emerald chips of ice. "Your research didn't just get the artist wrong. It's actively participating in the 400-year-old erasure of a female genius. You haven't found a lost muse. You've tried to bury Judith Leister again." The room was dead silent. The Sotheby's execs were pale. This was a disaster. Mark Vane was trembling. He was exposed. He was a fool. And he knew it. He looked from the pale execs to the stone-faced Damien Blackwood. He looked at the painting. And then he looked at Elena. All his rage, all his humiliation, all his desperation coalesced into one single target. "You," he whispered. Then louder. You bitch!" Chloe gasped. "You think this is cute?" Mark snarled, his corporate mask gone, revealing the ugly, terrified man beneath. "You think you can come in here with your new dress and your billionaire boyfriend and humiliate me?" He stepped toward her. "You set me up. This was your research. You gave this to me." "I did no such thing, Mark," Elena said calmly, not flinching. "Liar. You've been planning this. You nothing. You were a housewife. You were a failed academic. I gave you a life. I gave you everything." He was shouting now, his face a blotchy red. "And you were nothing. You were a drain on me. You were an anchor. You are useless." He was screaming the word. It echoed in the pristine $1,000,000 room. "Useless, useless, useless." He stood there panting, a man completely undone. Elena hadn't moved. She just watched him, the last vestiges of her fear of her old life burning away in the heat of his rage. She felt Nothing. He was just a loud, sad man. She was about to turn and walk away. But Damian Blackwood, who had been silent this entire time, moved. He didn't yell. He didn't rush to defend her. He simply stepped in front of Elena, shielding her, and took one calm step toward Mark Vane. Mark, faced with a man a foot taller and infinitely more powerful, flinched. Damian Blackwood looked at the trembling, broken man. He looked at the masterpiece on the wall. And then he looked back at Elena, who was watching him, her expression unreadable. He smiled. A real warm smile. He turned his head just slightly back toward Mark, but his words were for the whole room. For the Sotheby's execs. For Chloe. For history. "Mr. Vane," Damian Blackwood said, his voice quiet, clear, and utterly final. "You stand in the presence of greatness, and you call it useless." He reached out his hand, not to Mark, but back toward Elena. She took it. He brought her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "You see a useless woman," Damian said, his voice full of a reverence that stunned the room. "I see the only person I trust. I see the expert who just saved me $50 million. I see the woman who just in 10 minutes rewrote art history." He turned her hand over and kissed her palm, a gesture so intimate, so futile, it was a brand. He looked back at the sputtering Mark, and his smile was gone. "You may leave," he said. "But the painting, my client?" Mark stammered. "Your client," Damian said, "will be hearing from my lawyers regarding your fraudulent representation, as will, I suspect, the IRS. You," he said, "are done." Mark Vane stood speechless, broken, deleted. Damian Blackwood turned his full attention back to Elena, ignoring the wreckage of the man behind him. He smiled at her, a private, shared victory. "Don't listen to him, Ms. Hayes," Damian murmured, his voice for her alone, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "He called you an anchor. He was wrong. You're a lighthouse." He raised her hand still in his and addressed the room. "Gentlemen, please update your records. The painting is as Ms. Hayes has proven a Leicester, and Blackwood Holdings will be acquiring it, at her valuation." He tucked her arm in his, turning them both to leave. As they passed the speechless, horrified Mark Vane, Damian Blackwood leaned in and whispered one last thing to Elena, a final coronation. "Well done, my queen." The word speechless did not begin to cover the state Mark Vane was in. It was a complete systems failure. His mouth hung open. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a cheap rental, and the color in his face had gone from enraged red to a waxy, sickly white. Chloe, to her credit, was the first to react. Realizing she was attached to a sinking ship, she made a sound of pure disgust. "Mark, you're pathetic." She grabbed her tiny purse, hiked up her red dress, and clip-clapped out of the viewing room and out of his life on her 6-inch heels. Mark didn't even notice. The Sotheby's executive, smelling blood and, more importantly, a scandal, immediately descended. Not on Mark, but on Damian and Elena. "Mr. Blackwood, Ms. Hayes, our deepest apologies. We will, of course, honor Ms. Hayes's new provenance. A new press release? A new exhibition?" Damian held up a hand. "You will," he said, "speak to Ms. Hayes. She is handling the acquisition. And you will, as a professional courtesy, validate her findings and ensure that her name, Elena Hayes, is the lead academic on all press materials. You are, after all, correcting a 400-year-old mistake. It's the least you can do." He guided Elena out of the room, leaving Mark Vane to the wolves. As the door hissed shut, they heard the first of the questions, the quiet, panicked legalese of the Sotheby's team, realizing just how much fraud Mark had tried to commit on their premises. They were in the atrium, the city lights of New York glittering outside, when Elena finally let go of the breath she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking. You called me my queen," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. Damian turned to her. The severe billionaire, Mr. Blackwood, was gone. It was just a man, his pale gray eyes warm with something. Admiration. Respect. "A king is just a man with a crown," he said, his voice low. A queen. A queen has her own power. She moves the pieces. That's what you did in there. You were a queen. They were all playing checkers. You were playing chess. He stole my work, Damien. He stole 5 years of my life. I know, he said, and tonight you took it back, with interest. The ride down in the elevator was silent. When they were back in the car, the city sliding past in a blur of gold and white, she finally asked the question. How did you know? How did I know what? How did you know he was my ex-husband? How did you know about the research? Damien was quiet for a long time. I didn't, he said. Not for sure. When you first mentioned Vane, you said he was a visionary who wanted to connect the past to the future. That was a phrase from our old life. It was a private joke. It was what I used to say to him about my research. Elena went cold. You knew me before the gallery. No, he said. But I knew of you, or rather I knew of your work. Miss Hayes. Elena, do you remember a paper you submitted to the Dutch Quarterly Review? About 13 years ago, under the name E. Hayes. About pigment sourcing in the Utrecht school. She nodded, stunned. It was rejected. It was rejected, Damien agreed, by an old guard academic who coincidentally, I later found out, had stolen your premise for his own book. I was 28. I had just inherited my father's collection. I was trying to understand what was real and what was rich. I read your paper, the rejected paper. Someone on the review board leaked it to me. He turned to face her in the dark intimacy of the car. It was the first true thing I had read. It was brilliant. I tried to find E. Hayes. But you had vanished. You'd stopped publishing. You'd stopped existing. I assumed you'd left the field. I met Mark, she whispered. You met Mark, he affirmed, and E. Hayes disappeared. For 12 years I've had that paper, that one brilliant piece of research pinned to my wall, a reminder of what true expertise looked like. When I walked into the Gagosian, he continued, and you, the desk assistant, corrected me on the spot about the von Hess collection. Your voice was familiar. The logic was familiar. It was the same mind. So when Vane finally gets his meeting, Elena finished for him, and he uses my phrase. And then shows me a painting from the Utrecht school. Damien said, I knew it was either the world's biggest coincidence or he was a monster. I had to know which. You set this all up, she realized. The job, the office, the test. It was all to see if I was E. Hayes. It was, he admitted, and to see if E. Hayes was ready to come back. Elena was quiet. She was all her anger at Mark had been so hot it had burned everything else away. Now she felt a different kind of burn. This wasn't a rescue. This was a recruitment. You didn't just give me a raise at the Gagosian, she said, the pieces clicking into place. You're a silent partner in the New York branch, aren't you? Damien Blackwood had the grace to look slightly chagrined. My name is on the letterhead. Somewhere. Elena Hayes looked at the man beside her. The man who had read her obscure rejected paper. The man who had remembered it. The man who had really seen her when she was invisible to the rest of the world, including herself. She didn't know what to say. So she did the only thing that made sense. She started to laugh. It was a small rusty sound at first. Then it grew. It was a laugh of despair, of relief, of absurdity. She was laughing for the woman who had signed those divorce papers, for the woman who had cried over stale lo mein, for the woman who had just in front of the entire art world been called my queen. Damien watched her, his expression soft. What's funny? He called me useless. She choked out tears of laughter and release streaming down her face. He really had no idea, did he? No. Damien said, his own smile finally breaking free. He really didn't. 6 months later, the Wall Street Journal ran a profile. It wasn't on Damian Blackwood. It wasn't on Mark Vane. It was on Elena Hayes. The headline read, "The Useless Wife Not Quite." Meet Elena Hayes, the art world's new power player. Mark Vane, the article briefly mentioned, was facing multiple lawsuits. His Vane Global Strategies had been a shell company, a house of cards funded by predatory loans and bad deals. The $50 million sale was his last desperate gamble. When it failed, the whole thing imploded. He was last seen moving out of his 432 Park Avenue condo in the middle of the night. But the article wasn't about Mark. It was about the new Hayes Foundation, funded by an anonymous but not so anonymous tech billionaire, a foundation dedicated to identifying and reclaiming lost female artists. Its first acquisition, The Lost Muse, by Judith Leister, now the centerpiece of a new revolutionary exhibit at the Met, curated by and credited to Elena Hayes. The Gagosian was a memory. Elena now had an office on the 70th floor of the Blackwood Holdings building, an office that she noted was twice the size of Damian's. "You have more important work," he'd said with a shrug. Their relationship was a work in progress. It was not a whirlwind romance. It was something deeper and stranger and far more real. It was built on late-night arguments over pigment analysis, on shared respect, and on the quiet understanding that they were two people who had, in their own ways, been invisible for a very long time. He would come to her office at 8 p.m., not with flowers, but with a stack of new provenance files. "I need your opinion," he'd say, and she would give it. The My Queen name had unfortunately stuck. His security detail called her that. His board of directors called her that. It was, she grumbled, unprofessional. But she was in his helicopter flying to see a new find in Geneva when he'd turned to her. "You know," he said over the roar of the blades, "you never did give me your valuation for the Leister. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to pay you." Elena looked at him. The most powerful man she'd ever met, the man who had given her back her name. "You're right," she said. "We should settle that." She leaned in, and for the first time she closed the distance between them. It wasn't a kiss of gratitude. It wasn't the kiss of an employee. It was the kiss of an equal. When she pulled back, she smiled. "Consider it," she said, "a consultant's fee." He looked for the first time since she'd met him completely and utterly speechless. And that's how Elena Hayes went from being a ghost in her own life to the queen of her new one. It wasn't just about the money or the billionaire. It was about reclaiming her voice, her work, and her own worth. Mark's humiliation wasn't the victory Elena's freedom and her power were. She proved that the useless label he put on her was never about her at all. It was just a reflection of his own fear, his own inadequacy. What did you think of her incredible comeback? Do you think Mark got what he truly deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this story of justice and finding your power, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, so I know you want more stories just like this. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their own worth. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so you never miss a single upload. We all deserve to be seen for who we truly are. Thanks for listening.